Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to First Presbyterian Church of the North Shore. We are one church in two locations, and we are very glad you're here. Especially a warm welcome to any visitors this morning. We're delighted that you've chosen to join us for a time of worship and a time of fellowship afterwards. Everybody is invited to stick around for lunch at the lodge afterwards. So Derek will have more instructions, but basically we'll clear out the center aisles here, or the center chairs, and set up tables and have some good food and some good fellowship afterwards. But welcome. If you are a nursing mother and you'd like to participate in the service while you're taking care of your infant child, you can go up and to the right. If you have little kids who need nursery, you can go up and to the left. And we welcome everybody who's watching us on Danvers Community Access TV. And then one more administrative detail before we get started this morning. We will be taking up the offering during the third song. So if you're a visitor, please let that plate pass you by. The only thing we would like you to drop in the offering plate are some of these welcome cards that you may have picked up on your way in. But welcome to our service of worship. Let's enter a spirit of worship as we stand together and read responsively this call to worship. Let us give thanks to the Lord with our whole heart and glorify his name forever. For great is his steadfast love toward us. He alone is our deliverer. You, O God, are good and forgiving, abounding in steadfast love to all who call upon you. There is none like you, nor are there any works like yours. All the nations you have made shall come and worship before you and glorify your name. Teach us your ways, O Lord, that we might walk in your truth. Unite our hearts to fear your name. Let's continue to worship as we sing.
Treasure of greatest price, He giving me life, faithful again and again. Jesus, love never ends. No love, sovereign in all that you do, refuge, my hope is in you, mighty, your enemies from Jesus, you reign over all. To you you'll always be. Seeker, finding the lost, Savior, bearing my cross. You're worthy, you're the Lamb that was slain. Jesus, great is your name. It's who you are, it's who you are, it's who you'll always be. It's who you are, it's who you are, it's who you'll always be. Jesus, you are Jesus, yesterday, today, forever. You're the same, and everlasting, never failing. Yesterday, today, forever. You're the same. Yesterday, today, forever. You're the same. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you'll always be. Yeah. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you'll always be. It's who you'll always be. It's who you'll always be. Give me eyes to see more of who you are. May what I behold still my anxious heart. Take what I have known and break it all apart. For you, my God, are greater still. And no sky contains, no doubt restrains all you are. The greatness of our God. I spend my life to know that I'm far from close to all you are. The greatness of our God. And give me grace to see beyond this moment here, and to believe that there is nothing left to fear, and that you alone are high above it all. For you, my God, are greater still. And no sky contains, no doubt restrains all you are. The greatness of our God.
So the greatness of our God, that's what we want to experience more and more in our own lives. And we want the over 700,000 neighbors of ours in Essex County who don't know the greatness of our God. We want them to know that too. So we want to see our church, along with other churches on the North Shore, work in such a way that every man, woman, and child in Essex County would have repeated opportunities to see, hear, and respond to the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's why we exist, and we're glad you're here to share in that so that we can know the greatness of our God, but our neighbors can as well. So welcome to First Presbyterian Church of the North Shore. To help us be better prepared to do that work of the Lord as we're scattered throughout the week, we have a number of ministries, one of which is Adult Sunday School. We've been embarking this fall on both a course on how to study the Bible and a Bible study on the letter to the Colossians. So we invite everyone of a certain age, past high school, to come at 9 o'clock and join us for that right here in this room. We also have small group ministries throughout the week. So if you host or lead a small group, would you stand up right now so people can see who they might talk to about being part of a small group? There's a couple others not in the room today, and Josiah, who coordinates our small group ministry, is not here this week, but we really want everybody to be in a small group or in a discipleship group. So if you're not, please prayerfully consider that. If the bulletins arrived, I wasn't sure if they did, there's more information about small group ministries in the bulletin. We also want to nurture the children of the church, and we do have a children's sermon, usually on the third Sunday of each month. That's not going to happen this Sunday, but look for October to kick off that process. We also want to care for our kids. We need nursery workers. There's 30 slots to fill for this fall semester, some of which as early as next Sunday. So there's sign-up sheets at the welcome table for the kids just out to the left. So if you haven't already, please prayerfully consider jumping in and spend some time with the nursery ministry. And men's ministry, there's a men's breakfast coming up at the Ipswich campus on Saturday, October 5th. So make note of that on your calendar as well.
Well, again, welcome. And as John said a little while ago, we want to be a church that seeks the saturation of this area with the gospel. And part of the reality of that is that we understand we're desperate for the gospel as well. And we hope that through your time with us, if this is whether your first Sunday or you've been here for a while, we want you to know that this is a place where you can come indeed as you are, but we trust that Jesus is going to be working on each and every one of us through our time here. And that's what we want to do even in this next season as we move into listening to him through his word. And when I was a kid, I used to love reading choose your own adventure books. Do you guys remember those? This is some of them. You can actually buy this for like, $400 on the internet. You can get all, 80 or however many titles they have of choose your own adventure books. But if you're not familiar with it, essentially what a choose your own adventure novel or story is it's actually written in the second person. So it uses the word you all the time. And when you get to the end of a particular page, as the plot begins to thicken throughout the story, you choose where you go to advance the story. How many of you guys, anybody else read these? Okay, awesome. Yes, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you were like me, if you ever, there was this one spy book, I actually saw the title when I was looking through, thought about ordering it again, but then I realized it would probably make me feel bad because every time I read it, I always chose wrong. Then I'd end up getting captured, and then at the end I'd end up dying or something like that, and it was just lame. And I would always be like, no, I'm not going out like that, and I would review back, what page was I on a minute ago? I'm choosing something different. And in essence, I want you to think of today, especially, as a choose your own adventure story. If you're not familiar with this, think about movies with alternate endings. Now, you don't necessarily get to choose how I'm going to end my sermon. That's not what I'm talking about, though that would be interesting. Maybe we'll try that one of these days. But what I mean is that this story that Jesus tells is a choose-your-own-adventure story. He doesn't resolve it, and I think he does it purposefully. Now, honestly, anytime we come to the Scriptures, you could argue that it's a choose-your-own-adventure story. Because we're always left with the question, okay, how am I going to respond? But you're going to see, especially as we dive into this passage today, that that's exactly what Jesus is doing. How are we going to respond to this encounter that we have with him? But you get to choose the ending. And those of you who were here last week, you know we just started a new sermon series. Every Square Inch is the title of our sermon series for this fall. And what we're talking about is this idea of whole life discipleship, that God is after wanting to change every bit of who we are. And last week I actually put these up, and you're going to see these probably every Sunday throughout, because I want them to be ingrained in us. But 5 characteristics of a disciple. As I think about it, I tried to reflect biblically and just say, you know, if I was going to summarize what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, how would I do it in 5 characteristics? And this is what I came up with. Disciples are experiencing personal gospel renewal. And again, we're trying to unpack these as we work our way through. Disciples are deepening in affection for and intimacy with God. Disciples are growing in understanding and applying the gospel story to all of their life. Disciples are seeking and experiencing transformation of relationships in every arena of life. And disciples are seeking to reproduce the life of Jesus in others. That's what I see when I look at the Scriptures. And again, we're going to unpack that throughout each week as we go. But these next couple weeks, what I really want to focus on is how. How did these characteristics begin growing in us? And I think it's fair for us to ask ourselves, I've been asking myself these questions, am I really experiencing personal gospel renewal? Am I actually deepening in my affection for and my intimacy with God? Am I experiencing transformation in all of relationships that I have? On and on. But we want to ask, especially today and over the course of these next few weeks, well, how does that take place? And we might think, it might be tempting to think that sometimes transformation, God changing every square inch of us, that it's going to happen the way that lightning strikes. Just boom. All at once. Can I tell you that's not how it works? We might be tempted to think that change or transformation actually takes place through just self-reliance. Just us pulling ourselves up by our proverbial bootstraps and getting it done. Can I tell you that's not the way that it happens either? But we might also be tempted to think that it's just all wishful thinking. That there's absolutely no way God could change any one of us at the very core of who we are. And that's not true either. The more that I think about how God has been working in my life, and the more that I'm praying about God's ongoing work in my life, the more I'm convinced and convicted of the fact that God does it just by repeated exposure to the truth of His grace. That's how He does it. And that's what's going to happen today. We're going to look at what I would argue is the greatest parable in all of the Bible. You've probably heard it before. But can I tell you, literally, Jesus is so smart. If you haven't ever thought about that, think about it. There is no one as brilliant as He. No one. And in 21 verses, what I believe Jesus is going to do today is He is going to uncover the various layers of our hearts as humans. But as He does that, He's not only going to show us ourselves, but He's also going to show us our wrong perspective of God. And then He's going to invite us into a response of how we're going to live in light of our gracious, gracious God. That's what he's going to do. He's going to do what he does in all of his life and in all of his teaching. He's just going to expose us to the grace of God again and again. If you have your Bibles, turn to Luke 15. Pull it up on your phone, do whatever it is that you need to do. But we're going to be walking through a well-known passage today. But as you turn, I want to just situate this text. From Luke 9, verse 51, all the way to Luke 19, 28, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. That's important. It's important to note, even as we look just at Luke 15, because this is in essence a journey. It's a situation where Jesus is taking his disciples from Galilee and they're going to Jerusalem, and Jesus knows what's waiting there. But as he goes, Jesus is spending time with all kinds of people. He's hanging out with the oppressed and the possessed. He's hanging out with the poor and the broken, the blind and the lame. He's hanging out with sinners and tax collectors, but he's also eating at the homes of Pharisees. But what Jesus is doing all throughout this section, it's what he always does. But what Luke does in this section in particular is he is showing us, he's inviting us all on this journey with Jesus. This journey of discipleship and faith. And that's where we find this story. All of this teaching happens on the road. All of what we're going to read about shows us the perspectives that we all have about God and about even ourselves. And Jesus has just been revealing that over and over, repeatedly, moment by moment, literally step by step by step with his disciples. And if you look just at the first two verses of Luke 15, this is what you find. The tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him. And the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, and they said, "This man receives sinners and he eats with them." Now what you have to know, I said Jesus had been hanging out with Pharisees too. If you just turn the page, flip one page in your Bible, Luke 14:1 says, one Sabbath when he went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, Jesus is hanging out with some Pharisees too. He had friends in every quarter. But it's into that context that Jesus says, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that is coming to me." And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had, and he took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property on reckless living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and he hired himself out to one of the citizens of the country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise. I'll go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And so he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. But now his older son was in the field, and he drew near the house, and he heard music and dancing. And he called to one of the servants, and he asked what these things meant. And he said to him, 'Your brother has come. Your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound.' But he was angry, and he refused to go in. And his father came out and entreated him. But he answered to his father, 'Look, These many years I have served you, and I have never disobeyed your command, and yet you have never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him." And so he said to him, "Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and to be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found." Who's who? In the story, who's who? According to Luke 15, 1 and 2, there were sinners and tax collectors and also Pharisees who were gathered. So who's who? Jesus is brilliant. Who's who? Who's the older son? The Pharisees. I bet there are none of those in here today. Who's the younger son? The sinners and the tax collectors. Probably aren't any of those either. Do you think that's fair? Is that a fair assessment of humanity? What do you think? Is that a pretty fair assessment? Can you slice it into two groups the way that Jesus did? I love the way that Tim Keller puts this. He's got a book actually on this passage. And if you haven't ever read it, I'd encourage you to do so. But he says society is so deeply divided between these two approaches. What Keller calls the way of self-discovery, that's the younger son, and the way of moral conformity, that's the older brother. Society is so deeply divided between those two approaches that hardly anyone can conceive of any other way to live. The moral conformists say, the immoral people, the people who do their own thing, they're the problem with the world, and the moral people are the solution. The advocates of self-discovery say the bigoted people, the people who say we have the truth, they're the problem with the world, and the progressive people are the solution. But the message of Jesus' parable is that both of these approaches are wrong. And his parable illustrates the radical alternative. But what's the alternative? Jesus didn't lay it out there, did he? I feel like he insinuates it. He implies it. But there is one there. But if at face value we just look at the parable the way that Jesus told it, we do only see two ways to live, don't we? And we may even feel, if we're brutally honest with ourselves, we may feel like we oscillate between the two, don't we? Some moments we're the moral conformist, in other moments we rage against the machine. But the bottom line is we all oscillate between those two realities. But what if there is a third way? What if there is a radical alternative that Jesus is trying to put on display even by not saying it? It's a choose your own adventure story. We're going to see that as we work our way through. But the bottom line is we've all been warped by our pride. Every single one of us. And if we're ever tempted to think, well, not me, you're just deceiving yourself. We've all been warped by our pride. If you really get into the story itself here, you have to know that the request of the younger brother at the beginning of this parable is the most dishonoring and shameful thing that any person in the ancient Near East could ever do. It's literally saying, hey, Dad, wish you were dead. Would you mind liquidating some assets for me so that I can move on? That's in essence what the younger son is saying. Jesus is brilliant. He's scandalizing his listeners. And we have to put ourselves into the situation of the original listeners. Remember, he's got sinners and he's got Pharisees listening. But all of them would have thought, this request is worthy of death. The fifth commandment, honor your father and mother. You ever done that? One God, no idols. Respect God's name. Keep the Sabbath day. Honor your father and mother. You can do it with all the 10 commandments. We'll do it sometime. I'll show it to you. But the fifth commandment is honor your father and mother. This guy's dishonoring his dad. His dad could kill him. According to Deuteronomy 21, that would be legitimate. If you have a rebellious son, one who's given to gluttony and drunkenness, you can take him out and have the elders of the city stone him. But the father doesn't do that. Literally, he gives his life for the son. That's actually the word when in the text Jesus says he divides his property. Literally, the word property is the Greek word bios. He divides his life. It's not like the father had some excess cash laying around and he just gave it to his son. He had to sell a portion of his property to give it to his son. And in the ancient Near East, the older brother gets 2/3 and the younger gets 1/3. It's always that way. But the father divides himself. He divides his assets even before he's dead. When I was about 11 years old one time at Christmas, afterwards we had finished opening all the presents, and I remember, I'll never forget this. My mom said, "How was Christmas?" And I was like, "It was all right. I didn't get everything I wanted." Yikes. I was just like this younger son. Do you see in essence what's behind this? Dad, I want the cash, but not the communion. I want the comfort. I want you to make my life good, but I don't really care for you. Do you ever treat God that way? Jesus is brilliant. He begins exposing these realities under the surface. He doesn't have to say it. He just wants to make us think about it. So the father gives 1/3 to this younger son, and then he goes out and squanders it. Literally, he scatters it everywhere. There's actually gluttonous and sexual implications to the use of the word in the Greek. But then a few other words that are important. He spins it on reckless living. The Greek word there is asodzo. You seminarians, what does the Greek word sozo mean? Shout it out. To save. Without salvation. Asodzo. Recklessly. Without a care to salvation. It's high-handed rebellion that this young son is doing. And then he hires himself out. Literally, it's the word used when Jesus, in other passages, is talking about marriage and the relationship between a husband and wife joining themselves together. This son joins himself to a foreigner, a pig herder. Now again, if you were a Jew in the ancient Near East, at this point in the story, you would gasp. This guy has spent everything he has on reckless living, without a care to the world. And then he goes and he joins himself. He literally becomes part of a Gentile family. He basically says, you know what? Forget mom and dad. I want this family instead. And then he starts feeding pigs. And you would just hear the people go, pigs? Because pigs are unclean. This kid has now not only squandered his living, he's not only done the greatest offense to his father, but he's cut himself off ritually, ceremonially, and even relationally. He's at the lowest of low. And what is driving all of this for the son? Is it not the Adamic perspective of God? Right from the start, isn't it, you know what? Father must be holding out on me. I'm going to go get what I can someplace else. That's in all of us. It's been in all of us from the beginning. God says, look at all that I have. It's all yours. That kind of happens in this passage too, doesn't it? And then we say, yeah, but I'll take that. That one thing that you told me I couldn't have. I want that instead. See, our pride warps every single one of us to the point that we think that God is holding out on us. We're not looking for God's face, we're looking for his hand. We want the cash, not the communion. And then where is he left in verse 16? He's left with no one giving him anything. Be honest. When you have tried to drink deeply from the shallow wells of this world, what are you left with in the end? Nothing. And there's a contrast there, isn't it? Jesus is brilliant. There's a contrast between the generosity of the Father, even in the face of this son's great shame. There is a generous Father who gives you everything, and no one else gives you anything. You see what Jesus is doing, right? He's contrasting the generosity of the Father with the emptiness of what we chase. Again, even that takes us back to the garden, doesn't it? You can eat from all of these trees except that one. We are all warped by our pride. What is your wrong view of God? But what is your wrong view of yourself? You know what? I'm better on my own. I'm going to be able to live life to the full if I don't have to live according to God and his ways. Again, Tim Keller speaks of this. He says, the person choosing the way of self-discovery says, I'm the only one who can decide what's right or wrong for me. I'm going to live as I want to live and find my true self and happiness that way. We've been warped by our pride. But so as to think that it's not just the way of self-discovery that has warped us. Think about the way that the older brother has a wrong view of the father. Did you catch it? In verse 29, the older brother says, I've slaved for you all these years. Is that your perspective on relationship with God? Jesus is brilliant. He uses this language for a purpose. It is the word slave. It's not the word serve. It should be slave. I have slaved for you all these years and never disobeyed. Is that your perspective on the Father? He's the master, you're the slave. That's not the right perspective. That's not the heart of the Father that Jesus came to actually display. He said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Jesus was a friend of tax collectors and sinners and Pharisees. And he invited every single one of them into the heart of the Father. And the younger son thought, even as he came back, he thought that he could become a slave, right? I'll just become one of your hired hands. Do you ever get that? Do you ever think that sometimes repentance, when you come back to God, when you repent of your sin, you confess it and you say, Lord, I don't want to do that. Do you then get into the mindset of treating God like your master and you're his slave? But do you notice that even in this passage, the Father won't have anything to do with it? You cannot earn salvation. You cannot. The idea of coming back, I'll be your slave, adopting that older brother mentality, it's wrong. You can't do it. The debt is too great. That's in essence what this son is saying. Dad, I know I squandered everything. I'll pay you back. Just let me work for you. You're never going to be able to pull it off. And the father's heart won't have it anyway. But the older brother, this slave mentality, when he hears the party, it was dishonorable to not go. If there was a party at your own house, you'd go, wouldn't you? I mean, you would think you'd go. But this older brother, though he didn't get lost in a different country, he's lost under his father's own roof. I wonder if that is any of us. Do we have that perspective, viewing God as this begrudging father? who treats us like slaves. The older son sees only rules, not relationship. Really, they're just two sides of the same coin, aren't they, these two boys? One wants cash, not communion, and the other just looks at the rules, not at relationship. When the Father is offering it all the time. And the Father goes out to entreat the older son, just like the Father was looking down the road for the younger son. See, we've all been warped by our pride, but we can each be changed by his grace. But I say again, can. Can. It's a choose your own adventure story. It's a cliffhanger. Did you notice how Jesus ended it? The obvious questions ought to be, well, does the older brother go in? Does he go enjoy the party? But the other question ought to be asked about the younger son too, right? Does he make off like a bandit again? Even after the father has treated him so well? We don't know. Will you come in? Will you stay home? Will you respond to the grace of God the way that he's inviting each and every one of us? See, we've been warped by our pride, but we can be changed by his grace. Did you see all of the grace that's here? The grace to the younger son, the father puts a robe on him. Isaiah 61:10 says that we're clothed in the garments of salvation. Paul repeatedly says in his epistles that we need to be clothed with the righteousness of Christ. No matter what we've done, the garment that the Father puts over us is sufficient. He gives him a ring. That's a signet ring. You have all the authority of the family. In our shorter catechism, Ryan referred to one of the questions earlier. Here's question 34. What is adoption? Adoption is an act of God's free grace in which we're received into the number and have all the right and the privileges of the sons and daughters of God. That's the grace of the Father. That's the grace of the Father's heart. He gives us a robe. He gives us a ring. Did you know sandals were used to swear covenants in the ancient Near East? I know it sounds strange, but go read the book of Esther. Ruth. At the end of the book of Ruth, these two guys swap sandals because they enter into a covenant together. Jesus is inviting us into this third way, this way of adoption. And did you hear the word? When the Father looked down the road, he had compassion. The Greek word there, it's one of my favorite Greek words. It's the word splachnos. Sounds great, doesn't it? His innards were stirred. I think actually it attaches itself, listen, to Exodus 34, verse 6. When God revealed his name to Moses, he said, I am the Lord, the one who is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and compassionate, having mercy on thousands of generations. God's heart overflows in compassion. The Father doesn't stand when he sees the young son coming back going, this ought to be good. The Father runs. My brother lives in the Middle East right now, and he says, Arabic men do not run, ever. This Father runs. It would almost be shameful for an Arabic man to run, but this Father runs because his heart is overflowing with compassion. And he falls, literally the Greek says he falls upon his neck. And what do you expect? He falls upon his neck and he's choking. He falls upon his neck and he kisses him. That's the heart of the Father. That changes, it can change us. But there's also grace to the older son. The Father comes out and he entreats him. The word there is the word paraclete, parakaleo. It's the same word that's used to describe the Holy Spirit in the life of a believer. He comforts us. He entreats us. And yet this older son is angry. Now there's something else that we have to pick up there. You remember that the father says, all that I have is yours. You understand that that's literal, right? Because again, put yourself in this situation. The younger son has ran off with his third, and it's gone. What the father currently owns belongs to whom? The older son. This is where Jesus' brilliance really shines. So whose robe did the father give? Whose ring? Whose sandals? The older son's. Did you know that in the ancient Near East, it was actually the responsibility of the older brother to reconcile fighting parties in their family? It's the reason why God asked Cain, hey, where's your brother? And Cain said, I'm not his keeper. The older brother should have gone after his younger brother. Now again, this is brilliant. In the context, and we don't have time, but if we were to look back, Jesus tells 3 parables here, not just this one. He tells 3. And the first 2, both had people who were seeking in it. The lost sheep, the shepherd goes and seeks. The lost coin, the woman goes and seeks. What is missing from this passage is a seeker. We should be longing, when we hear this parable, we should be longing for a better older brother. But you get the point, don't you? It's Jesus. That's why in Luke 19:10, Jesus says the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost, whether they're younger brothers or older brothers. See, this older brother, our older brother, has the heart of the Father. How do you change? By grace. See, all that pride distorts, God's grace can transform. All that our pride distorts, God's grace can transform. How? Remember, Jesus is telling all of this on a journey. You got to join the journey. You got to listen as he teaches. You got to keep walking with him and see his heart of grace exposed over and over and over again. God's grace changes the way that I live so that I don't pursue selfish license, nor do I pursue self-righteous legalism. God's grace changes the way that I love, not just the way that I live, but the way that I love. I love him, but I'm also open to the outcast and to all kinds of lost people, just like he is. It's God's grace that can transform. All that pride distorts, God's grace can transform. You remember the story of Les Mis, right? Most of us probably haven't ever read the novel. We've seen the musical or you've seen the movie. But I highly recommend the novel. I'm very slowly working my way through it right now. You remember the scene, even if you've just seen the movie or the musical, you remember the scene where Valjean, who has just been released from prison, goes and he stays at the home of the bishop. And in the night, he wakes up and he steals the silver, and he goes out and he gets caught, and the soldiers bring him back, and the bishop actually tells the guards that he gave him the silver, though he didn't. And he even gives him the silver candlesticks. And then he says, Valjean, with this silver, I've purchased your soul. And I give you back to God. It's like a choose your own adventure. How's Valjean going to live? In light of that grace, how's Valjean going to live? Well, in the novel, listen to what Victor Hugo writes as this scene unfolds. When Valjean left the bishop's house, he was quite thrown out of everything that had been his thought up to this point. He could not yield to the evidence of what was going on within him. He hardened himself against the angelic action and the gentle words of the old man. You have promised to become an honest man, Valjean. I buy your soul. I take it away from the spirit of perversity, and I give it to the good God. This conversation recurred to his mind unceasingly, and to this celestial kindness that opposed pride, which is the fortress of evil within us. He was indistinctly conscious of the pardon of this priest, that it was the greatest assault and the most formidable attack which had ever moved him. Oh, that's beautiful. Yet he realized that this hardness would be finally settled if he resisted this clemency. And yet if he yielded to it, he should be obliged to renounce the hatred with which his actions had once filled his soul through so many years, and which pleased him. That this time, it was necessary to conquer or to be conquered, and that the struggle, a colossal and final struggle, had been begun between his viciousness and the goodness of that man. The bishop had hurt his soul as too vivid a light would have hurt eyes on emerging from the dark. In the future life, with all of its possibilities that offered to himself, henceforth all of the pure and radiant life filled him with tremors and anxiety. He no longer knew where he really was. Like an owl who should suddenly see the sunrise, this convict had been dazzled and blinded, as it were, by grace. That which was certain, that which he did not doubt, was that he was no longer the same man, that everything about him would be changed, that it was no longer in his power to make it as though this bishop had not spoken to and touched him. Whatever pride warps, God's grace can transform. But if you know the story, there's also Javert. The one who in the musical says, I am the law, and the law is not mocked. I spit your pity right back in your face, for there is nothing on earth that we share. Which will we be? How will we be changed? Well, it's God's grace that can transform. There's a third way. All that our pride warps, God's grace can change. Father, as we approach your table this morning, we think about this reality that this grace is not just one that you have spoken, but it's one that you have shown us. And Lord, as we come, as we approach these elements, Lord, would you do your work in our hearts? Lord, speak to us, older brothers or younger. Change us, oh God, by your grace.
How deep the Father's love for us. boast in Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection. Oh, why should I gain from his reward? I cannot give an answer, but this I know with all my heart. His wounds have paid my ransom. Why should I gain from his reward? I cannot give an answer, but this I know with all my heart. His wounds have paid my ransom. His wounds